The unexpected arrival. The galaxy was a vast and mysterious place. Space stations, planets, and ships dotted the stars, each home to its own strange life forms and civilizations. Some species were peaceful, some were aggressive, and some lived in constant fear of what lurked in the deep, dark corners of the universe. But there was one thing that all civilizations shared. They all feared the Deathworlders. Deathworlders, creatures from planets where survival itself was a battle, were known across the galaxy as the most dangerous beings alive. Their strength, endurance, and will to survive made them both respected and feared. The crew of the Starship Horizon had heard stories of the humans, Deathworlders who had fought and survived wars, faced unimaginable hardships, and come out stronger each time. But even they never expected to see one in person. It all started with a simple request. The crew had been under heavy stress. Their mission, to broker peace between two warring factions, had dragged on for months. Tensions were high, and morale was low. The officers were tired, worn out, and, according to the station's counselor, needed a way to relieve stress. So they placed an order for a personal trainer, someone to guide them through physical exercises and meditation to help them regain their energy. They thought it would be simple, a calm human who would help them relax. What arrived, however, was far from what they expected. As the Starship Horizon docked at a bustling space station for supplies, a large figure stepped off the transport shuttle. Commander Ilara, the leader of the Starship Horizon, watched through the station's observation windows as the figure approached. She raised an eyebrow. The man wasn't what she had imagined. He was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, and his body was built like a warrior's. His broad shoulders, muscular arms, and battle-worn skin made it clear he wasn't just some average human. His eyes were sharp, cold, and full of experiences that most of the crew could never imagine. "I hope this isn't the trainer we ordered," Ilara muttered under her breath. But there was no turning back. The man stepped aboard the station with the confidence of someone who had seen wars, survived countless battles, and emerged victorious every time. His eyes scanned the crew with a sense of calculation, as if analyzing their every move. There was an aura of danger around him, something the crew could sense but couldn't fully understand. The station's administrator, Lieutenant Arden, quickly approached the newcomer. "Welcome aboard. You must be our new trainer. We've been looking forward to your arrival," he said, trying to sound friendly. But the Deathworlder only nodded, his expression unchanging. "I'm here to train you to survive," he replied, his voice low and heavy with authority. Survive. That was not what they had expected. The crew had thought they needed a trainer to help them stretch their muscles, reduce stress, and increase physical endurance. What they didn't know was that their galaxy had many dangers they were unprepared for. The Deathworlder's arrival meant something far more serious was in store. Ilara couldn't hide her confusion. "What do you mean by survive? We're not soldiers, we just need a little help getting our energy back." The Deathworlder looked at her for a long moment, his piercing gaze making her feel small. "You may not be soldiers, but soon enough, you will be. You just don't know what's coming." With that, he turned and started walking toward the gym. The crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of his words. Was he joking? Or was there something more to his statement? Lieutenant Arden followed the Deathworlder into the gym, where the rest of the crew was already gathered, waiting for their training session to begin. They stood around, whispering to each other, uncertain of what to expect. When the Deathworlder entered, all eyes were on him. He stood in front of them, his presence commanding the room. "Today, we begin your training," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "I don't care how tired you are. I don't care about your comfort. I only care about one thing, your survival." The crew members felt a chill run down their spines. This was no ordinary workout. This was something more, something they hadn't prepared for. "I've trained warriors from countless worlds," the Deathworlder continued, "but none like you. You're soft. You're not ready for what's out there." But after today, you will be. Commander Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. What was he talking about? What kind of threats could be out there that they weren't prepared for? As the Deathworlder began the session, his training methods were unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It wasn't about stretching or light exercises. It was intense. It was grueling. And as the hours passed, the crew began to understand what he meant. They weren't just preparing for a mission. They were preparing for something far worse. The Deathworlder was no ordinary trainer, and his arrival wasn't just about getting them in shape. Something was coming, and the crew had no idea what they were about to face. The first training lesson: a brutal awakening. The crew of the Starship Horizon had barely caught their breath after their initial encounter with the Deathworlder. They had all hoped that their first training session would be a calm, peaceful affair. After all, they were only looking for some light exercises to relieve the stress of months spent in deep space. But the Deathworlder was not a man who believed in easing into things. He immediately set a brutal pace, leaving no room for hesitation or weakness. The moment the session began, it was clear to the crew that this was not going to be a typical training experience. Everyone in a line, the Deathworlder ordered, his deep, gravelly voice sending a chill down their spines. The crew, still a bit unsure of what to expect, quickly complied. They lined up, glancing nervously at each other. The Deathworlder stood in front of them, looking like a beast among them. "Today, we'll start with something simple," he said, his eyes cold as they scanned the crew. "Push-ups, but I'll make sure you're doing them right." The crew members exchanged puzzled looks. Push-ups. They had expected to start with something less intense. But before they could question the Deathworlder, he gave his command. "Start. Now." The crew dropped to the floor, attempting to follow his instructions. Some of them struggled, their bodies sore from weeks of inactivity, but they pushed through, determined to prove they could handle it. The Deathworlder stood above them, his arms crossed. He watched them with a calculating gaze, his face betraying no emotion. As they struggled, he barked out instructions. "Faster. You call that a push-up? This is pathetic." His words stung. The crew was used to working under pressure, but this was different. This was more than just physical exertion. This was a test of their limits. One by one, they faltered. Some collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Others stumbled but managed to push through. Sweat dripped down their faces, and muscles ached with every movement. "Keep going," the Deathworlder shouted, his voice growing more intense with every passing second. "You want to survive out there. This is what it takes. Not comfort, not rest. Survival. You're all weak. You'll never survive the real threats in this galaxy if you can't even handle basic training." The crew members struggled to keep up. It felt like an eternity before the Deathworlder finally allowed them to stop. "Rest for 5 minutes," he said, his voice still as cold as ever. "Then we move on." The crew collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and gasping for breath. They couldn't believe how hard the first exercise had been. This wasn't like any training they had ever experienced before. Lieutenant Arden, the station's administrator, wiped sweat from his brow and looked over at Commander Ilara. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. "This is insane." Ilara, who had kept her composure throughout the session, glanced up at the Deathworlder. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "but I'm starting to think we're in way over our heads." The Deathworlder hadn't been kind. He hadn't been gentle. But Ilara could see something in his eyes. He wasn't doing this to punish them. He was preparing them. But for what? After the brief rest, the Deathworlder led them to the next exercise. Hand-to-hand combat training. This wasn't just about strength. It was about learning to defend themselves against foes far more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered. He began to demonstrate techniques with brutal precision, showing them how to strike, how to defend, how to survive. His movements were swift, powerful, and calculated. He didn't waste time on unnecessary flourishes. Each move was meant to deliver the most damage in the shortest amount of time. "You'll need these skills when the galaxy comes knocking," he said between strikes, his voice low but commanding. "Out there is no mercy. No one cares who you are or what your rank is. You survive, or you die. It's that simple." Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine as she watched the Deathworlder in action. The way he moved, the sheer force of his strikes, it was clear that he had fought in countless battles. He wasn't just training them. He was teaching them how to survive in a universe where death could strike at any moment. After several hours of intense training, the crew was battered, bruised, and beyond exhausted. They had been pushed to their limits, but the Deathworlder wasn't finished. He gave them no time to rest. "Tomorrow, we start again," he said, his voice unwavering. "You're nowhere near ready." As the crew limped back to their quarters, their muscles aching and their minds racing, one thing was clear. They had only just begun to understand the gravity of the situation. The Deathworlder wasn't just some trainer. He was a warrior. And the crew of the Starship Horizon had a lot to learn. The fight for survival, pushing past the limits. The following day arrived quicker than expected, and the crew was still sore from the previous day's grueling training. They had barely slept, their bodies protesting every movement. But there was no time for recovery, no time for weakness. The Deathworlder was relentless. As they gathered in the training room, weary but determined, the Deathworlder stood waiting for them. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid. The crew had learned by now that there was no room for excuses. If they were to survive, they had to endure whatever came next. Today, it wasn't just about push-ups or hand-to-hand combat. The Deathworlder had something much more demanding planned. "Today, we test your limits," the Deathworlder announced, his voice carrying an intensity that sent a chill down their spines. "You're here because you wanted to be trained, to survive. But survival isn't a choice. It's an instinct, a warrior's instinct. And I'm going to push that instinct out of you." The crew exchanged nervous glances. They knew they were in for something worse, something far beyond what they had already experienced. But no one said anything. No one dared to question the Deathworlder. They had learned that much the hard way. "Get into formation," the Deathworlder commanded. "This is not just training. This is your future. Every move counts. Every second counts." The crew complied, forming a tight line in front of him. As they waited for the next instruction, their hearts pounded in their chests. Ilara, the commander, felt her mind race. Could they really handle this? Could they survive the hell that was about to unfold? Without warning, the Deathworlder launched into a series of moves so fast that the crew barely had time to react. He grabbed one of the trainees, an ensign named Kieran, and tossed him across the room with ease, sending him crashing into the wall. Kieran gasped for breath, struggling to get up. "What the hell?" he wheezed. "That's the reality out there," the Deathworlder said calmly, turning to face the rest of them. "Enemies that will tear you apart if you don't learn to defend yourselves. Kieran is lucky. He's still alive. That's more than some can say." The crew stared at Kieran, who was slowly getting back to his feet. His body was already bruising, his arms shaking, but he didn't quit. No one did. Not after what they had seen. The Deathworlder gave a brief nod of approval. "Good. That's what you need to do. Get up, no matter how hard it is. Because out there, the only thing that matters is your survival." He turned back to the rest of the crew. "Form pairs. We're going to do a combat exercise. You're going to fight like your life depends on it." Because it does. The crew hesitated for a split second, their exhaustion weighing heavily on them. But they didn't hesitate for long. Slowly, they paired off, unsure of what to expect. The Deathworlder, standing off to the side, observed them with a critical eye. The first test, surviving the unknown. The days blurred together as the crew continued their grueling training under the Deathworlder's unrelenting guidance. The initial shock of the brutal exercises had faded, but the pain remained. Each day pushed them further than they thought possible, testing their strength, willpower, and the very core of their survival instincts. The crew had learned to brace themselves for the unexpected. They no longer flinched when the Deathworlder barked commands, or when another exercise seemed to appear out of nowhere. They had started to understand that the unpredictable was their new reality. But nothing had prepared them for what came next. After a week of non-stop physical and mental challenges, the crew was summoned to the training hall. They had been through endurance runs, simulated combat, and even simulated battles with hostile aliens. But today, the Deathworlder was going to take it to a new level. Today is different. The Deathworlder's voice echoed across the room, his tone more serious than usual. Today, we test your ability to think under pressure, your ability to survive when everything goes wrong. The crew stood in their usual formation, silently awaiting their instructions. They had learned not to question the Deathworlder. They just needed to be ready. You've been trained to fight, to endure, to never give up, the Deathworlder continued. But there is one thing you need to learn above all else. It's not about strength or speed. It's about surviving the unknown. He nodded to a corner of the room. With a flick of his hand, a set of control panels blinked to life. In the blink of an eye, the room transformed. The bright lights dimmed. The walls shifted, and a loud whirring noise echoed through the chamber. Before the crew could react, the floor beneath them began to shake. The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The crew's hearts raced as they scrambled for footing. Panic set in briefly, but the Deathworlder's voice cut through the chaos. Survive, he commanded simply. Do whatever it takes. You are on your own. A loud sound erupted, and suddenly, strange shapes began to move around them in the darkness. They could hear the creaking of metal and the hiss of steam. Whatever was happening, they weren't ready for it, but they knew there was no turning back now. The crew immediately scattered, each member instinctively seeking a safe spot, though no real safety existed here. The unknown threats, whatever they were, could be anywhere. Some of the crew tried to communicate, their voices echoing in the oppressive dark, but the Deathworlder's training had taught them not to rely on others for support. They had to rely on themselves. Suddenly, an eerie noise broke through the silence. An alien hiss, followed by a high-pitched screech. The crew froze. The sound was unmistakable. It was an alien predator, something they had been trained to fight, but never faced in a real-life scenario. Ilara, the commanding officer, signaled to her team. Stay calm. Move quickly. Stay together, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the fear was palpable. They had trained for moments like this, but nothing could have prepared them for the terror of encountering a real threat in such a confined, unknown space. The screech grew louder. The crew could hear the skittering of claws against the metal floor as the creature moved closer. It was hunting them, just as they had been trained to hunt. But now, the stakes were higher. They were no longer practicing. They were surviving. A crew member, Lieutenant Kieran, who had been injured earlier in the training, tried to move towards a corner, but a shape lunged at him from the darkness. He barely had time to react before the alien predator's claws scraped across his armor. Kieran cried out in pain, but instead of freezing, he fought back with everything he had learned. The sound of combat erupted in the dark, followed by a loud crash. The crew could hear the struggle, the grunt of exertion as Kieran fought for his life. He was no longer the same hesitant ensign they had met just a week ago. This was a man fighting for his survival. Ilara rushed toward the sound of Kieran's struggle, hoping to help him, but the Deathworlder's command rang out once more. Survive or die. This is your test. She stopped dead in her tracks. There was no time to save him, no time to help anyone else. She had to think. She had to survive. The crew had been pushed to their limits, and this moment would test everything they had learned. The entire crew scattered into the darkness. Each person moved quickly, evading the predators as best as they could. Their senses were heightened now, their instincts in full control. Every footstep echoed in the silence, every breath more precious than the last. In the chaos, Ilara found herself face to face with a large, towering alien creature. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, its claws sharp enough to tear through their armor. But Ilara didn't hesitate. Her training kicked in. She grabbed a weapon from the floor, an energy blade she'd been trained to use. The creature snarled as it lunged toward her, but with a swift movement, she sliced through its neck, severing the creature's head in a single blow. She stood there, panting, her heart racing. She had done it. She had survived. Slowly, the lights flickered back on. The creature's body crumpled to the floor as the room returned to normal. The crew, exhausted and bruised, gathered in the center of the room. They had all faced their fears and survived. The Deathworlder stood silently in front of them, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he nodded in approval. "You have passed," he said, his voice calm. "You are no longer just trainees. You are survivors." The crew, though battered and bruised, stood a little taller. They had faced the unknown, and they had proven to themselves that they could survive. They were no longer just learning to fight. They were learning to endure. And that, the Deathworlder knew, was the true test of a warrior, the unexpected allies. The days after the grueling test passed in a blur of exhaustion and triumph. The crew was physically beaten, but something had changed within them. They had all crossed a threshold, one that few others would have ever been able to. They were no longer just trainees. They were warriors in the making, hardened by the cruelty of the Deathworlder's trials. However, despite their victories, something still gnawed at the back of their minds. The Deathworlder's cryptic words echoed in their thoughts. "You are survivors, but the real test has only just begun." None of them knew exactly what to expect next, but one thing was certain. The universe had not been kind to them so far, and the trials were far from over. The following week, an unexpected arrival threw the crew into a whirlwind of surprise. A sleek, unfamiliar ship appeared in orbit, a vessel unlike anything they had ever seen. It was larger than anything the crew had encountered before, with sharp angles and a sleek, black design that radiated an aura of mystery. Its arrival was an anomaly. No prior communication, no warning, just an unexpected presence in their space. A tense silence filled the command center as the crew gathered around the monitors, their eyes scanning the foreign ship. Was this another test? Or had something more dangerous arrived on their doorstep? Ilara, now fully embracing her role as a leader, was the first to speak. "Prepare the fleet for any eventuality. Keep your eyes sharp. We don't know who or what this is." But the Deathworlder's words echoed in her mind. "Survive. That's all that matters." The crew stood ready, weapons at their sides, as the strange ship hovered in the sky. But the unexpected happened. Rather than launching an attack or taking aggressive action, the ship's communication system activated. A crackling voice filled the airwaves. It was a language none of them recognized, filled with strange sounds and clicks. The voice was accompanied by strange images, alien symbols that seemed to pulse across their screens. "This is unexpected," Kieran said, squinting at the alien symbols. "What is this?" Ilara's hand hovered over the communication panel. She knew they had to be careful. Every alien encounter so far had ended in either a fight for survival or a harrowing escape. What could this mean? Before she could respond, the Deathworlder stepped forward. His presence was commanding, and the room fell silent. "Let me," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority. Ilara nodded, stepping aside. She had learned not to question the Deathworlder's instincts. If anyone could figure this out, it would be him. The Deathworlder approached the communication panel with ease, his fingers flying across the buttons. The alien symbols on the screen shifted and changed, as if responding to him. The crew watched in tense silence, their hearts pounding in anticipation. Whatever was happening, it was something beyond their comprehension. Then, a sound filled the room. An unmistakable voice, one that spoke in clear, perfect English. "We come in peace." The crew froze. This was not what they had expected. Was it some sort of trick? Or had they finally encountered a species that was willing to communicate rather than fight? The voice continued. "We are the Exytheans. We have been watching your species for some time, and we wish to offer an alliance." The name meant nothing to the crew, but the mere mention of an alliance was enough to raise suspicion. In the galaxy, alliances were rarely a good thing. They were often about gaining leverage, not mutual cooperation. "Why now?" Ilara asked, her voice filled with caution. "What do you want from us?" The response was immediate. "Your strength has caught our attention. The way your species fights, survives, adapts, it is unlike anything we've ever seen. We wish to forge an alliance with humanity, to help us in a war that threatens us all." The crew exchanged glances, their wariness palpable. Who were these Exytheans? And what exactly did they want from them? Ilara's hand tightened around the edge of the control panel. There was no way to trust these aliens fully, not yet. But the offer was tempting. An alliance with an advanced species, especially one with knowledge of the galaxy's darker corners, could be a game changer. But the Deathworlder was not as easily swayed. "And what do you offer in return?" he asked, his voice cold and calculating. The voice on the other end hesitated before responding. "Knowledge, weapons, resources. We offer you everything we have in exchange for your strength." Ilara turned to the crew, her face hard with determination. This was a crossroads. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of their fate, about deciding who they could trust in this chaotic universe. The crew knew that an alliance could tip the scales in their favor, but trusting these aliens, these Exytheans, was another matter entirely. The Deathworlder had always taught them that trust was earned, not given. And as tempting as the offer was, they were all too aware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. Ilara took a deep breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. She knew they couldn't afford to make the wrong decision. Their very survival depended on it. "Make them wait," Ilara finally said, her voice steady. "We'll consider their offer, but we're not making any decisions yet. Keep the fleet on alert." The crew nodded, their eyes still fixed on the screen. They knew this was a pivotal moment. Their next move could change the course of their journey and their survival. As the transmission ended, the room fell into silence once again. The unexpected had arrived. And now, the crew would have to decide if they were ready to face the unknown allies, or the inevitable dangers that might come with them. There was no hint of deception in the words, but Ilara still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The promise of peace sounded too perfect, too convenient. She glanced at the Deathworlder, who gave her a small, knowing nod. "We'll take the time to consider your offer," Ilara responded, her voice steady. "But we'll need to meet in person to discuss terms. We don't make decisions lightly." The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment before replying. "Of course, we will arrange a meeting. I look forward to our collaboration." As the transmission ended, Ilara's stomach churned with uncertainty. The Deathworlder placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, as if sensing her doubts. "They will come," he said quietly. "And when they do, we will be ready." Ilara nodded, though she didn't feel entirely ready. The next steps would be crucial. The crew couldn't afford to make the wrong move, and they certainly couldn't afford to trust the Exytheans without knowing more about their true intentions. The risk of trust loomed over them all, but there was no turning back now. They had to face it head-on. The future of humanity and their war against the galaxy's enemies depended on it. The question remained, were the Exytheans truly allies, or just another threat in disguise? The ultimate test. The time had come. The Exytheans had agreed to meet in person, and the humanity fleet was preparing for the most significant encounter they had ever faced. The crew stood ready, their nerves tight as the day of the meeting approached. Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a situation far more dangerous than they realized. There was something about the Exathians that unsettled her, a subtle energy that suggested not all was as it seemed. The Deathworlder, as always, was calm, focused. His unblinking eyes scanned the space around him, analyzing every movement, every sound. If there was anyone she could trust to navigate this moment, it was him. He had remained by her side since the very beginning, never once wavering, never once showing doubt. His instincts had been their guide through many close calls, and Ilara trusted him more than anyone else. But even now, as the crew gathered in the briefing room, there was a lingering question that no one could answer. What was the Exathians' true plan? Ilara stood before the crew, trying to steady her nerves. She had been through countless battles, had faced death more times than she could count. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for trust, for the very future of their civilization. "We've come this far," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. "This meeting will determine everything. Whether we emerge as allies or enemies, this is the moment that will define our next steps. Stay vigilant. Watch their every move. The Exathians are good at hiding their true intentions." The crew exchanged looks of agreement, tension running through the room. They all knew what was at stake, and every one of them felt the weight of the decision they were about to make. The Deathworlder spoke, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Remember, Captain, if something feels wrong, we act. No second chances. Trust your instincts. Trust each other." Ilara nodded, taking in his words. "Understood. Prepare yourselves. We meet them on neutral ground." The fleet's command ship was soon in position. The Exathians had selected a small, uninhabited moon as the meeting site, a location that was as mysterious as it was isolated. There were no other ships around, no distractions, just the human fleet and the Exathian delegation. Ilara had ordered the fleet to maintain a heightened state of alert, but her hope was to keep things peaceful. For all the questions that clouded her mind, she wanted this to work. They needed it to work. As their ships neared the moon's surface, the Exathian ship appeared, sleek and shining in the distant void. It was far different from the bulky, intimidating human vessels, a graceful design that almost seemed to mock the raw power of the fleet. The two ships docked, and the meeting began. Ilara, accompanied by the Deathworlder and a select group of officers, stepped into the Exathians' vessel. The air was thick with an unspoken tension as they entered the alien craft. The Exathians waited, standing tall and imposing, their eyes glimmering with an unreadable depth. The leader of the Exathians spoke first. "Captain Ilara, we are honored to meet in person. We hope that our alliance will bring prosperity to both our people." Ilara eyed the leader, trying to read the subtle signs of any deception. "We've heard your proposal," she said, her voice firm. "But words are just words. We need proof. We need to see what you're offering, and what you expect in return." The Exathian leader's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, but first, allow us to demonstrate our power, so that you may understand the value of our offer." A signal passed between the Exathians, and suddenly, the room grew colder. The walls hummed with strange energy as technology the humans had never seen before activated. Ilara's hand instinctively moved to her sidearm, but the Deathworlder stopped her with a look. "Do not act unless they give you reason," he murmured. The Exathian ship began to glow with an eerie light, and a holographic map appeared in the center of the room. It showed vast fleets, weapons of unimaginable destruction, and the bones of countless civilizations scattered across the galaxy. Ilara's heart clenched as she realized what was happening. This was not a demonstration of peace. It was a warning. "The power we offer is unmatched," the Exathian leader continued. "Join us, and we will give you the strength to crush your enemies. But refuse us, and you will fall before the might of the galaxy." Ilara's mind raced. She had expected something like this, But hearing it firsthand was something else entirely. The offer was tempting, but the consequences of accepting it were more dangerous than they could comprehend. They were being drawn into a game they didn't fully understand. But as the Deathworlder stood beside her, Ilara felt a flicker of hope. He had always known how to turn the tide. He was the one who could see through the fog of lies. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We don't make decisions under threats," Ilara said, her voice strong. The room filled with tension. "Your power is impressive, but we don't kneel to anyone. We will decide our fate on our terms." The ex-Ethian leader's smile faltered, and for the first time, Ilara saw the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. This was no longer about an alliance. It was a test. And Ilara knew that their next move would decide everything. Would they bend to the ex-Ethian's will, or would they stand tall and face whatever came next? The fate of humanity and the galaxy hung in the balance.